Reading in John chapter 1 this morning. John chapter 1, there's an old saying that I'm sure you are familiar with. That is, hindsight is what? It's 2020, right? Hindsight is 2020. Things often look so much clearer when you look back on them, when you look back on the past, and I think that is probably true of so many situations in life. So many times the present moment is clouded by our own desires, they're clouded by our own wants, the things that we think we need. And there's oftentimes just an involuntary bias towards a certain disposition or another. But when we look back and we say, why didn't things work out the way I thought they would? Why didn't things come out the way I wanted them to at this point or at that point? Sometimes, not always, but sometimes I think God allows us to see the why. I've found that in following the Lord, things don't always make sense in the present. And, I've spent a lot of time reflecting on hindsight lately, especially as I prepared for this day and for this moment when I would stand here and deliver this morning and tonight my final sermons as your associate pastor. The last time I'll preach in this place as your associate pastor, but by no means, I hope and pray, the last time I'll ever preach in this place. And because I hope Brother Eric will allow me to be back on somewhat of a regular basis to fill the pulpit as needed. But I've been looking back on how all this came to be. And I could go back and I could bore you with detail after detail and how God derailed my plans time and time again to, I believe, guide me to this path and to this point today. I'll just start with, I didn't plan originally to attend Ouachita Baptist University, but God made it work. God worked out the details and guided me there. And then by the time I got there, I loved Arkadelphia. Not very many college students say that when they are there, but because of jobs I had off campus and ways I got involved in the community, I had no desire to leave Arkadelphia when I graduated from OBU, but God had other plans. And God put this job opportunity in front of me to come to SAU and to work as assistant to the president at SAU and to work through the various jobs that I had there. And I look back in hindsight, and I think I can see some of the reasons why. And, of course, one of the reasons is sitting right down here on the second pew. And then one of the other reasons is sitting beside her. And then I think about the special churches that have been able to be a part of my life because God led me to this community. And, of course, I have to start with the First Baptist Church of Magnolia. I went to First Baptist for one reason. It wasn't because of the music. It wasn't because the people were so friendly, and they were. I went for one reason, and his name was David Watkins. I tell people you shouldn't pick your church based on the preacher, but I did. Brother David had been a special part of my life all my life. He baptized my father when my father was a teenager at Beach Street Baptist Church in Crossett, Arkansas. And then my dad died when I was 8 years old, and Brother David assisted with his funeral then in El Dorado. Brother David has been a special part of my life for a long time, and I went to First Baptist because he was there. Since I graduated from Ouachita, Dr. Rankin assumed I was a Southern Baptist, and I had nothing against the Southern Baptist, but I wasn't. And I remember he told me that we got two great Southern Baptist churches in Magnolia. You'll love either one of them. That's what Dr. Rankin told me, but I already knew where I'd go and met so many wonderful people there. Dustin Wisely, who's their current pastor, and at the time was their youth pastor, who allowed me, this young 20-something-year-old who he didn't really know, to help chaperone church camp. I loved church camp, still love church camp. I was saved at Daniel Springs. While I was chaperoning with Dustin at Daniel Springs, I felt the undeniable call of the Lord on my life to surrender to the ministry, and I did that. And there's so many others that I could name, but I won't bore you with that. But there's one I will name that impacted my life and impacted your life, whether you know it or not. And that's Mike Goodwin. I've probably told this story. Mike has impacted people's lives in ways I can't say from this pulpit, probably. Mike's a character, isn't he? But one night, I remember the night I was there at the house I lived in at the time on Cleveland Drive in Magnolia, and my phone rang, and it was Mike, and he said, hey, there's this preacher that I had never heard of. Never heard of Eric Goebel. Who's this guy? There's this church. I had never heard of Brister Baptist. Leaving Magnolia, I had never come south on 79 far enough to see Brister at this point in time. I couldn't picture it. I didn't know anything about it. He said he's looking for a second guy. He's looking for somebody to bring on board to be the associate pastor, to work with the youth. We didn't have a title at that time. Mainly to work with the youth, but to be a bivocational person, and I gave him your name. Mike said, now he's going to call you and just tell you he wants you to come fill the pulpit one week, but I wanted you to know he's really looking at you for this other thing. So I had to come down here that first time to just preach, I think on a fifth Sunday, and I couldn't let anybody know that I knew that Brother Eric was looking. At the time, I don't know that Brother Eric had let the church know that he was officially looking for this second person. So I came and preached. I came again. Time went on. Brother Eric and I got to know each other. And in late 2011, I came on board as the associate pastor. And we won't talk about the 53-week sabbatical I took to a far and distant land some 60 miles away. But for the better part of the last 13 years, I would be lying if I said you'd become like our family. Because you haven't. You have become our family. I've been a member of Brister Baptist Church longer than I've ever been a member of any other church in my life. You are our family. One of the hardest parts of the decision to accept the job and eventually move to Conway was moving away from our family, our biological family. But you too. You know, we grieve the loss of our close association with you. And in hindsight, I'm confident that God placed each and every one of you in our lives to prepare us for the journey ahead. Now, I probably can't repeat from the pulpit some of the ways some of you have influenced us. But it's all been good. In the September 11th edition of the Baptist Trumpet, there was an article about me in the CBC column, and what I told the writer of that article is true. And I couldn't think of another way to say it today, so I'm just going to read what I was quoted as saying in that article about you, all of you. I said, they have encouraged me, invested in me. You paid for my seminary degree. Dr. Atterbury, the president of the BMA Seminary, is here today. Dr. Atterbury, these people right here paid for me to attend the BMA Seminary. Changed my life. But I said, you've encouraged me, you've invested in me, you've put up with me more than I could have ever expected. These are some of the hardest working and deeply loving people I've ever met. And I am who I am today in large part because of Brister Baptist Church. Of course, we're not moving until the end of May, but starting next month, as I take on more responsibility at CBC, I'll be out in other churches around the state visiting and discussing the work of CBC and preaching as I have the opportunity. And when we're here, we're going to be here like regular members. There's a lot of room on that back pew back there this morning, and that may be where we're at, you know, when we're here just as regular members. But at some point, I'm going to have to do something I've never done before, and that's pick a new church. Because as a child, that decision was made for me. When I left college and moved to Magnolia, that decision was essentially made for me because Brother David was only at one church. The Lord brought me here. I've never actually had to pick a church before where I had no connections. We'll never replace the love we found here. You have set the bar so high. And I just want to say thank you. So now, I'm going to try to preach from John chapter 1. Of course, we've just come through the Christmas season. I love Christmas. I know you love Christmas. We sing the Christmas carols every Sunday in December up to Christmas. Last year, I got in trouble from a few people because I was leading worship and I dared to sing something other than a Christmas carol during December. Anyway, don't make that mistake, Brother Garrett. You see, now I'm leaving a year later. No, but we love Christmas. We preach through the month of December. Every Sunday, we preach from the Christmas story. And we love that. And the majority, though, of what we see about the Christmas story, just from my perspective, this is the way I think we see the Christmas story through one of two lenses most of the time. We can go back and we can look and we can preach the Christmas story from the Old Testament. Every line of the Old Testament points to Jesus. And we preach the Christmas story through the prophecies about the Messiah who is to come. Or the other option is we preach it much like the angels who appeared to the shepherds and said, "For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, who's Christ the Lord." We preach the Messiah who is to come. We preach the Lord who has arrived. Two ways we often look at the Christmas story, and they're both excellent ways to look at the story. They bring forth the expectation and the overwhelming joy that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. But as we come to the beginning of the Gospel of John, we find a different approach to the Christmas narrative. It's a perspective we really can't see if we only are looking at it at the Old Testament promise of one to come. This is a perspective we really can't see if we're only looking at Christmas through the eyes of those in Bethlehem on that silent night. Because I'd submit to you that John's perspective is one of hindsight. Read with me in John chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. John chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. This man came for a witness, to bear witness of the light, that all through him might believe. He was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light, which gives light to every man coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world didn't know him. He came to his own, and his own did not receive him. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, to those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness of him and cried out, saying, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me is preferred before me, for he was before me." And of his fullness we have all received, and grace for grace. For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has declared him. Let's pray together this morning. Father, I thank you for your word. I thank you for the truth of your word. I thank you for the insight of your word. And I thank you for the fact that your word and the truths that we draw from it are as relevant to us today as they were when they were penned nearly 2,000 years ago. I pray now that you would speak to us through your word, show us the things that you'd have us to know. In Jesus' name, amen. John's gospel starts out a bit different than the other three. If we were to turn back and we were to look at the beginning of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we'd see that Matthew begins with a genealogy, that big list of names that I don't like to read because I can't pronounce some of them, but it's very important. It's very important because it sets up the legality, the legal structure that says that Jesus is a descendant of David, just as the Messiah must be. If we looked at Mark, we would see that Mark begins with the Old Testament prophecy concerning the fact that John the Baptist would come and would be the forerunner for Jesus Christ. And he tells the story there of John the Baptist a little bit. And we see that Luke starts out with birth narratives. The birth announcement and the birth narrative of John the Baptist, the forerunner of Christ. And then in Luke 2, that all too familiar story, that oh so familiar story of the birth of Jesus Christ. And those three approaches, those are great ways to start a gospel account. Those are three great ways to tell the Christmas story. Well, if your audience is Jewish, for the most part, in that day and age when John wrote, that would have been a great way for John to have done it if his audience was by and large Jewish, because the Jewish audience would understand the importance of Jesus' genealogy and the importance that he was a legal descendant of David. They would understand the weight brought on by the Old Testament prophecies about John the Baptist that Mark starts out with. They would understand the importance and they would know about the role that John the Baptist played as Luke tells about John's birth before he tells about Jesus' birth. But John writes his account in a different place and to a different group of people. He writes his account in Ephesus. Some nearly 70 years later, scholars say, after the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, John's an old man. John's writing to a different group than the other three gospel writers. In the earliest days of the church, most Christians had a Jewish background in the earliest days of the church. Not so by the time John wrote this. One scholar that I read says that the greatest majority of Christians in John's day, and of course in Ephesus where John writes, the greatest majority of Christians were Gentiles. They had no Jewish background whatsoever. They didn't understand the importance of the genealogy. They didn't understand the importance or have the background of the Old Testament prophecies. They weren't familiar with people in the story like John the Baptist. So John looks back on all that the Nativity was and all that Jesus is, and he finds a word, a single word that the Jews understand, and this same word the Greeks understand, the Gentiles understand. And he wraps the entire Christmas narrative around this word that in our English translation is translated word. Logos, the Greek word. I want us to consider just a few things about the Logos this morning. And the first thing I want you to see that John points out here is the undeniable reality of the word. The undeniable reality of the Word. John doesn't mince words as he starts writing this gospel narrative. He doesn't say, maybe one time, once upon a time, there was this person, there was this logos, there was this Word. He says, in the beginning was the Word. John wants to start off first and foremost, he wants his audience to know that this logos he is describing, this person he is describing as the logos, is real and has been there since the beginning of time. William Barclay's translation puts it this way: when the world had its beginning, the Word was already there. This Word, this logos, is not created. It's something that completely boggles our mind, something we cannot wrap our finite minds around, is that God has always existed. God is infinite, and so is the Word. It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and here boggles our mind. The Word was God. The Word is deity. The Word has existed from eternity past. What John is saying here to us today, Christmas doesn't start in Bethlehem. Christmas doesn't start with the announcement of an angel to Mary. Christmas doesn't start when an angel appears to Joseph to confirm what's going on with Mary. Christmas doesn't start when the census is called and all people have to go back to their ancestral towns. Christmas starts in eternity past. Christmas begins before the foundation of the world with what John describes as the Logos, the Word. Let me just stop for a minute. I should have already done this. Stop and examine, what is the Logos? What is the Word? How would the Jews have understood this? How would the Greeks have understood this? Now, it's real simple. To the Jews, see, they had two different understandings of this word. To the Jews, a word is more than just a sound. A word has power. A word is something that goes out and does something. Think about the creation account John wants us to. He starts out just like the creation account in the beginning. Think back to the creation account. And what do we read all throughout the creation account? We read, and God said, let there be. And the New King James Version says, and it was so. And God said, let there be, and it was so. Words are powerful. And you say, yeah, but that's the words of God that are powerful. To a Hebrew and to people in the Middle East, even down to today, words are powerful. In the Hebrew language, according to one scholar that I read, because there's people a lot smarter than me, there's only about 10,000 words in the Hebrew language. And you say, well, that's a lot of words. Listen, I know people that use more than 10,000 words in an hour, it seems like. I'm not pointing fingers, and neither should you. But 10,000 words sounds like a lot of words until you realize that in this day and age, in the Greek language, there were about 200,000 words. So I did a little Google search, and you should always trust what you read on the internet, right? No. But according to my Google search, there are more than 1 million words in the English language today, in the Western American English language, and they're adding new ones all the time. So I did another Google search and said top new words in 2024. They always put out a list, right? I thought you'd like to know a couple of these, so I'm giving them to you. Greedflation, that's all one word, greedflation. That's the rise in prices due to corporate greed. Doom scrolling, all one word, doom scroll. It's like a train wreck sometimes when you're on social media. You're looking at Facebook or Twitter, and it's just bad news after bad news, but you just can't stop looking at it. You can't turn away. What bad thing am I going to see next? Doom scrolling. Now, this one is something that maybe some of you want to try to do, okay? Petfluencer. Sounds like a disease, but it's not. Petfluencer. These are people who gained notoriety on social media because of their pet. I didn't say any of these were intelligent. I just said these were new words that they were adding to the dictionary, apparently, because in America, talk's cheap. Isn't that something we say? Talk is cheap. Not to the Hebrew, not to the people that John would have been around. A different understanding of the word in that culture. Look back, you don't necessarily have to turn there, but in Genesis chapter 27, we see the story of Jacob and his mother Rebekah hatching a plan to trick his father Isaac. Jacob pretends to be his brother Esau, and Isaac falls for the trick, and Isaac blesses Jacob instead of Esau. And listen to what happens in Genesis chapter 27, verse 30. Now it happened as soon as Isaac had finished blessing Jacob, and Jacob had scarcely gone out from the presence of Isaac his father, that Esau, his brother, came in from his hunting. He also had made savory food and brought it to his father, and said to his father, "Let my father arise and eat of his son's game, so that your soul may bless me." And his father Isaac said to him, "Who are you?" He said, "I am your son, your firstborn Esau." Then Isaac trembled exceedingly and said, "Who? Where is the one who hunted game and brought it to me? I ate all of it before you came, and I've blessed him. And indeed, he shall be blessed." Isaac had already spoken the word of blessing to Jacob. The words had power. The words had already left his mouth. He couldn't take them back. He has to tell Esau, "I'm sorry, but I've already blessed your brother." Words have power. We would do well to remember the power and effect of our words. Just like we tell kids all the time, once you squeeze the toothpaste out of the tube, you can't put it back. And we might kind of laugh and kind of, oh, that's a neat little analogy, but it's true. Once the words come out, they're gone. "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words may never hurt me" is the biggest lie we ever told as far as words are concerned. Words have power, and the Jews understood that. So when John says, "In the beginning was the Logos," in the beginning was the power. In the beginning was the power that's behind everything. The Greeks understood it differently. They understood this word logos to mean reason. Logos is the order of the universe. It is the reason, it is what causes day to become night and night to become day on such regularity. It is what causes the seasons to change. It is what causes the stars and the moons to move exactly as they do, like clockwork every single day. It's what causes the tide to go in and the tide to go out. It's the reason behind everything. For the Greeks, the Logos is the power that puts sense into the world. It's the power that creates order instead of chaos. It's the power that got the world going and keeps the world going. To the Greeks, the Logos was literally the mind of God. And John says, yes, absolutely. And if you want to know the mind of God, it's real. It always has been. It has existed since eternity past, and it became flesh, and you can experience the mind of God. If you want to know the mind of God, there's no longer any reason to guess. There's no reason to grope around in the dark, because he became flesh and dwelt among us. If you want to know what the mind of God is like, he has a name, and it's Jesus. And he says in verse 18 down here, "No one has seen God at any time. The only begotten Son who is in the bosom of the Father, he has declared him." That word declared means to make fully known. Wow, you talk about mind-blowing to these folks. You want to see the order behind the universe? Just look at Jesus. The undeniable reality of the Word. Look down at verse 14. We're going to skip a lot. We're going to come back to it tonight. If you come back tonight, we'll look at some of this we skipped. But look at verse 14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. The glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Here, John says you can see the unblemished revelation of the Word. Completely unblemished. John said not only is the Logos real, not only does he have a name, not only did he live among us, we beheld the glory of God in him. Now here we enter into somewhat a new territory for the non-Jewish readers of John's gospel account here, because John is saying the one who brings order to chaos, the one who brings sense into a senseless situation, the one who created the world and sustains it day in and day out. He took on human flesh. We saw him, we experienced him, we know him, and the insinuation is you can too. You can too. You can know him too. You can experience him too. We beheld his glory, and so can you. What's his glory? The Jews would have understood it to be the Shekinah glory of God, the visible presence of God, the visible manifestation of God. And something I think we need to note, it rubs off on you. We could go back to Exodus and read the account of Moses and his encounter with God on the mountain, and he comes down, his face is glowing, the glory of God is rubbed off on him. And you say, that was back then. Well, if we looked in Acts chapter 4, we'd find Peter and John. We'd find them arrested for preaching about Jesus. They have to appear before the Sanhedrin to defend themselves. And, you know, these are the folks that Adrian Rogers would call the high muckety mucks. Always wanted to use that word from the pulpit, or that phrase. They have to appear before these guys, and they have to defend why they're preaching what they preach. And in Acts chapter 4, verse 12, it says they stand before the Sanhedrin and they say, nor is there salvation in any other, for there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved. And after they said that, the very next verse, Acts 4:13 says, now when the Sanhedrin saw the boldness of Peter and John, they perceived that they were uneducated and untrained men. And they marveled. And they realized that they had been with Jesus. The glory of Jesus rubbed off on Peter, and it rubbed off on John. And it was evident in their boldness, and it was evident in the way they lived their life. Friends, when we spend time with Jesus, people around us will realize it. We don't have to tell them. We don't have to fake it. It's there. It is genuine. What does the glory of Jesus look like in our lives? I'd submit to you that Paul calls it something else. He calls it fruit. And over in Galatians chapter 5, he says it looks like love. It looks like joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control. That's what the glory of Jesus looks like in our lives. And the more time we spend with him, the more time we behold his glory one-on-one, the more it will shine through us. And others will see the glory of Jesus because of it. One last thing, and I'll be done this morning. Not only did John behold his glory, he saw something else in the life of Jesus. He saw that Jesus was full, we see this in verse 14, full of grace and truth. We know what truth is, right? I hope we do. Truth is the facts as they pertain to reality. It's not your truth and my truth, okay? Despite what society wants you to think, Those are made up terms. There is only the truth. And it's the facts as they pertain to reality. And in John chapter 14, Jesus says, I am the truth. He says, I'm the way, I'm the truth, I'm the life. I'm the truth. There is no truth apart from Jesus. So we got that part, right? We know what truth is. I want to finish up our time together talking about this word grace. He's full of grace and truth. What is grace? Grace is the unmerited favor of God. Grace is when God gives us something we could never earn and we don't deserve. I've heard many preachers describe grace as an acronym for God's riches at Christ's expense. It's by grace we're saved through faith, is what Ephesians 2:8 tells us. But look down at verse 16. And of his fullness we have all received. So we've all received from his fullness. So what have we received? What's he full of? Grace and truth. We've all received grace and truth. But then there's this interesting little phrase, and grace for grace. Of his fullness we have all received, and grace for grace. A more literal translation of that Greek phrase there is that we have received grace instead of grace. That is a weird phrase, isn't it? Just on its surface level, we've received grace instead of grace. What does that mean? It means there's different forms of grace. It means sometimes we need this grace and sometimes we need that grace. It means that only through the Logos who became flesh and dwelt among us do we find the grace to make it through every individual moment of life. The kind of grace we need to make it through the prosperous times is different than the kind of grace we need to make it through the times when the bank account may be a little more empty. The kind of grace we need when life is sunshine and roses is a different kind of grace than the grace we need when we stand beside the headstone of a loved one. We need one type of grace to bear our own burdens. We need a different type of grace to help a friend or a loved one bear theirs. And no matter the situation, whether we're talking about grace for prosperous times or hard times, Jesus provides both. If we're talking about grace for the sunshiny days and grace for the days when the storms of life have gathered, the Logos provides both. John says, if we need grace to bear our burdens or to help a friend bear theirs, he's got grace for whatever situation we face. Sometimes we need one type of grace, sometimes we need another. And John says Jesus is full of grace. It is quite literally an undiminished reservoir of grace. And we have access to that grace through faith in the fact that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. If we proclaim that the Christmas story is about God sending his Son to live and to die in our place so that we can go to heaven one day, we're telling the truth, but we're only telling half the story. As I heard one preacher say, salvation is more than a fire escape from hell. For those of us who know Jesus, John says we need to know, and Christmas ought to remind us that the Word became flesh, not just so we could trust Jesus and be saved, but so that we could have grace to sustain us today. Grace instead of grace. Grace upon grace. And for those of us who know Jesus, we can probably look back in hindsight and we can see where God gave us a certain type of grace to get through this moment. And God gave us a certain type of grace to get through this moment. And like the Apostle Paul, we can look back in hindsight, something so much easier to do than in the present moment, and say, I know His grace is sufficient. Because He gives me grace to meet whatever need. So as we prepare for the invitation this morning, I'm just going to ask a question. Are you struggling with something today? The one who brings order to chaos he's got enough grace for you. And it's going to be enough grace to help you with whatever you're dealing with tomorrow, but access to that grace only comes if you've accepted the one who brings it. You know, there in our text in John chapter 1, verse 12, it says, but as many as received Him, to them He gave the right to become the children of God. If you've already received Him, you've already got access as a child. But if you've never accepted Him, would you look to the Christmas story this morning? Would you look to the Christmas story and know that God so loved the world, that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in Him shall not perish, but have everlasting life? Would you know that He's got enough grace to save you for eternity? And that as Romans 10:13 says, whosoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. Would you let Him save you? And then would you depend upon His grace to get you through today and tomorrow and whatever this life brings? Whatever the Lord has laid on your heart, let's take care of that as we stand and sing.
113.